they each have their advantages and disadvantages. You know, there's this way that film is always external. You're always looking at a character and thinking, or at an actor playing a character and thinking, wow, you know, like maybe I'm getting drawn into them. I'm kind of so invested in their story that I'm moved by them. I'm moved by the performance. I'm moved by their predicament. But you remain you, and they remain them. They're on screen, and you're looking at them. Whereas on a book, you're looking through somebody. You can kind of embody a character in a book. You can start to think as they think.
The library was my space, and there was just so much.
To the Harbor Grace excursion with the boys to have a time.
Eleanor and I went out for lunch today with our publisher, and I was saying how nice it was to be out eating different food with pants on, and it continues to be nice to be here with pants on. So thank you for coming in your pants.
I've been living in the United Kingdom where pants means underpants.
Oh yes.
And so I've now got an instinctive flinch. Sorry, that's going in a strange direction already, isn't it?
We're already going downhill, aren't we? But we're here today to talk about Eleanor's new novel, Birnam Wood. And it is out tomorrow, so we're sort of celebrating here today. And I know most of you, if not all of you, won't have read it. So what I'd like to do is talk about Eleanor's literary life from the beginnings up until she arrived on the stage today. And then we'll have her read a short passage and talk a bit about the influences behind her novel. And then we'll talk a little bit more about the themes. And at the end, we'll open up to questions. That sounds good? Okay, so I'd like to start in 1985. You were born in London, Ontario. Yes. Oh, are we representing? Can you tell us your memories? Do you have any memories of London, Ontario?
I do, not from 1985, but from a couple of years later. So my parents are not Canadians. My dad is an American and my mum was a New Zealander. And my dad had got a scholarship to pursue a PhD at the University of Western Ontario. So they'd come over with their 2 children, my elder siblings, and were convinced they were done having children. They were definitely not going to have another child. Oh. And then I was born, and I think I added about 4 years to my dad's PhD.
There's probably an equation that calculates. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So we left in 1991. So I was 6 when we left.
Okay.
And I have very strong memories from that early time actually. My mum went while we were living there was studying for a master's in library information studies, and she worked at a library in downtown London at the Pond Mills Library. I don't know if it's still.
Oh yeah.
Oh, yeah, great. Yes, I've a lot of memories that are very much centred in that building, and just kind of enjoying a really happy childhood there actually. Yeah.
Do you have any books that you remember from that time?
Well, there was somebody who lived on our block who was a published author, and that really struck my imagination as a young child. Her name was Margaret Merrifield. I don't know if my parents have kept in touch or if they still know what she's doing now, but she'd written a book on AIDS awareness to kind of teach AIDS awareness to young children that was called Come Sit By Me. And I just remember, I think that if I had a copy now, I would be able to tell you what was on every page. I remembered it so well, just because it was just, I don't know, explosive to me that there was I could connect the book with the person who'd written the book.
Oh, neat.
And the book I could hold in my hand. It was just wonderful. So I don't know if that was where my ambition to become a writer came from, but it certainly made me feel that it was possible.
Yeah, that it's possible. Yeah. Okay, and then you moved back to New Zealand with your family, and you went to school there. And Wikipedia tells me that you made zombie movies with your friends, and I'm dying to hear about
Is that on Wikipedia?
Yeah, it is.
Oh man, I've had a very strict no self-googling policy in place for about
Right.
6 years, but sometimes it's so maddening, and I wish I'd kind of never taken the vow.
Well, I
because-
was impressed because you're very ahead of the zombie curve, because this was in the 90s, wasn't it? 90s or...
Oh, thank you very
or- yeah.
much. Yeah, we like to think so. Yeah, I remember there was one particular effect that we achieved where somebody's. I don't know why I'm talking about this. Really,
No,
but
because I
the,
asked. It's important.
Somebody was laid out on a slab, and we kind of made our knuckles like this, but then went and so it looked like we were kind of pulling guts out, but it was actually that we were just folding our hands at the knuckle. I remember that. It was a very highly sophisticated effect that we achieved, you know.
The zombies. But I guess then you knew film was possible too, which is something that you...
Yeah, I've always been interested in film. But my parents never had a television when I was growing up, and this was something that I complained about bitterly throughout my childhood. I was not very well behaved about it. But yeah, I've always kind of had an interest in drama and you know, I was in plays and so on.
Right.
When I was growing up. But there was a competition in New Zealand. I don't know if there's a similar thing here. That's called the 48-hour film challenge, where you're given a genre, a film genre, and a line of dialogue, and I think a character you have to include or something like that. And then you've got 48 hours in which to shoot, edit, score, kind of everything, and you have to deliver it at the end of that 48 hours.
Wow.
And so that was where kind of some of the zombie movies came from.
Oh, that was the zombie
Yeah.
movies. Okay, ahead of their time. Okay, and so then you went to university in New Zealand, and you published your debut novel at age 22, The Rehearsal.
That's right, yeah.
And it's I don't know if anyone's read it. It's a novel set at an all-girls school, and it's about a teacher's relationship with his underage student. And I wonder how publishing your debut novel was for you. What kind of experience was it?
It was amazing. Yeah, I was so lucky to be published young, I think. I had written the book as my thesis for a creative writing degree that I took at Victoria University of Wellington. And originally it had kind of begun its life as a play, actually. There was another of these competitions where you could kind of write a monologue, and if the theatre liked your monologue, then they would give you the money to put it on. And at the time I had a girlfriend who was a really accomplished saxophone player, and I had the idea that I could tell a story of a kind of an abusive relationship, or a kind of a relationship of predation between a saxophone teacher and her student, where both the teacher and the pupil would be played by the same person, and so that you would kind of use the saxophone as the kind of transition between both roles. And so I wrote this monologue. It wasn't very long. It's what is now probably the first, I think, 2 or 3 pages of the novel, and submitted it for this competition, and it didn't get picked up. There was somebody else won. But I later returned to that piece of writing and suddenly thought, oh, this is interesting as a play, but maybe actually it would be even more interesting as a piece of fiction if you could, you know, that essential doubleness this wonderful doubleness that you always get on stage between the actor, who of course you can see, you know, as an actor, and then the role that they're playing, and seeing both things at the same time. It's just one of the great pleasures of theatre. And I suddenly thought, what if that was happening on the page? What if on the page you had both the roles that were being played, and you also had a cast of characters that were playing those roles within a novel? And so that was kind of where that book.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, that book came from. So it did begin life as a monologue, even though it never. That kind of never happened.
I see echoes of that in Birnam Wood too, which we'll get to
Yeah,
later, but that's kind of interesting.
That's interesting you say that. Yeah, it's funny now, because now that I've written 3 books, I can see commonalities between them now that I couldn't kind of along the way, because there's the 3 dots to join up. And I think that there's this interest in doubleness that I have, or the kind of the deceptions that are part of our constant kind of role playing in our lives, whether they're deceptions by kind of mutual consent, or deceptions by an attempt to coerce.
Yeah.
I'm kind of interested in that, and so all of my books, I think now, I'm only really now seeing for the first time, are interested in the fictions that we perform to one another all the time, whatever that might mean.
Yeah. Keep that theme in mind, because we'll pick up on that one. Okay, so then you went to Iowa, to the Writers' Workshop, which is a very prestigious MFA program. And why did you decide, you were already published at that point, why did you decide to do an MFA?
Well, I was published in New Zealand, but not anywhere else. And at the time, there was a very, very rich man who had been to, it's kind of a long story, but he'd been to Iowa in the poetry stream, and then had this kind of Damascene moment where he realized that he should not be a poet and instead should make billions of dollars. And so he went to Las Vegas, and I don't know if this is true or not, but apparently was responsible for kind of taking Las Vegas out of the control of the mob and kind of making it an engine that was going to work for Wall Street, which, I mean, this is very fantastical. I don't know if it's true. But he needed then some wines to be able to sell in all these hotels that he owned in Las Vegas. So he came to New Zealand and bought up all these vineyards. So this is a very long story.
I'm just,
and ended up buying these vineyards that would then service these properties that he owned.
Okay.
But because he had been to Iowa, he got in touch with some local poets in New Zealand and said, oh, maybe as a philanthropic gesture, I'll send over one New Zealander to the Iowa Writers' Workshop every year.
Oh.
And so for about 10 years, one New Zealander went over, and it was kind of like a work experience type of deal. So you weren't there for the whole 2 years, which was also slightly odd. You were only supposed to be there for one of the 2 years and then come back again, and then the next person would go. And I was very, very lucky because I went over in 2008, and then apparently he lost all of his money in the global financial crisis. So I was kind of the last
in
of
2008. You were it.
The
finale.
Right. And I always felt kind of slightly odd about that money, because I don't know what... I mean, I guess all money, I don't know, maybe we should feel
again
odd
very
about
topical for
all
your
money. But I don't know if I was there on gambling money. I don't really know how he made his fortune, or mafia money. I don't really know what it was.
That's an amazing story.
But then, I mean, I just had such an amazing time there that I ended up asking if I could stay on for the full degree, and so I stayed on.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah, for another couple of years.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And then we'll come to the Luminaries, which I'm sure some of you have read. And it is set in 1866 in the goldfields of New Zealand, and it won the Man Booker, it was called at the time, and the Governor General Literary Award for Fiction in Canada. And I think I read that it was the longest book, so it's 832 pages by the person who had lived the shortest life thus far. So Eleanor was 28 years old when you won the Booker, which is amazing. And I wonder how, I mean, I think of myself and I get self-conscious and I have trouble writing the next day when I've been to someone's living room for a book club. So I was wondering how it felt to win the Booker and how that affected your writing thereafter.
I mean,
it's a big question.
Yeah, it was. It's a very hard thing to know how to feel about, really, because literary prizes are so strange. They're essentially, they're so passive, and I mean, your relationship to them is so passive. You're not really competing in any meaningful way with anybody, and the prize is bestowed on something that you worked on usually quite a long time ago. You kind of finished quite a long time ago. So it happens, and then your whole life changes, and so you have to treat it as a life-changing event, but at the same time, you kind of haven't really done anything. It's just kind of, it's been done to you,
Yeah.
you know, in this kind of very strange way. It was, I mean, it was an interesting period, I suppose, because when I began working on the luminaries, it was such a strange project to describe. I had this idea that it was kind of a conceptual idea for the book, that I had found this computer program which would allow you to key in any date and time you could think of, and any geographical location on Earth, and it would kind of spin around and show you what was happening in the sky at that date and time, and from that place. And so I had the idea of keying in the date that gold was first discovered by white people, on the west coast of New Zealand, South Island, and just to see what was kind of happening in the stars at that time. And I started watching what was happening over the goldfields, and this idea for this novel came out of that that kind of movement of the heavens. I suddenly thought, okay, what if all of these were characters, and I could kind of use this as the template for kind of, you know, writing a novel that would mimic the movements of the heavens. But whenever I was describing this to anybody while I was writing it, just the look of just, I don't even know what it was, kind of pity that would kind of come over their face was very dispiriting. And I was, my boyfriend at the time, now my husband, was, I mean, he's a poet, and, you know, like, so obviously not contributing very much to our family finances. And so this idea that I was working on this just ridiculous novel, and we're kind of thinking, you know, time's running out. But then the book had this absolutely charmed publication life. It was just extraordinary, really, because it was longlisted for the Booker Prize before it was published, and so it kind of never was disassociated from that prize. It never had a life separate from that prize. But I mean, it was extraordinary. It was totally life altering. Yeah.
And then how, coming out from that experience, I just imagine myself going back to the computer and looking at a blank page. I would find it a lot to sit down and write after that. Was there pressure?
Yeah, there was. Yeah, I mean, the pressure of wanting something to be good, I depend on that pressure. I really like that pressure. So I wasn't really bothered about that so much. There was a certain tone to a lot of the interviews around about that time which kind of had the form of, so when are you going to choke? Are you going to choke? Is it going to be now? You know, it was that kind of thing. I was getting this kind of strange feedback from a lot of people that's like, okay, we all know how this goes, you know. We've all seen those movies where you're going to be kind of rolling around on the floor and, I don't know. And so, yeah, the kind of guarding against that and you know, feeling that this just totally disproportionate exposure that this prize brings has the capacity to turn your head, and it kind of messes with you. And I took that very seriously and kind of wanted to try and guard myself against it as much as possible. But I don't know. I ended up with quite a strange relationship with the novel, actually. It's a novel that I kind of, I sometimes have this kind of intense doubt about it that is very different than actually to my first book. I have a kind of an affection towards my first book, but I really don't know what to make of the luminaries in a funny kind of way. And I think it's partly because the response to it was just so overwhelming. I kind of felt lost in that, in a way. I almost never reread my work after it's done, and I had the opportunity of rereading the luminaries from start to finish because I contributed a hardback edition to a pen auction in the United Kingdom recently, and they wanted it annotated, you have to go through and make the annotations. And it was a crazy experience reading it again because it was a totally different book than
Oh,
I
really?
remembered. I'd forgotten whole parts of it. It was just, I just kind of couldn't quite believe it. I couldn't believe that it existed. And it was very odd. Like the parts of it were way worse than I remembered. I was like, oh God, this is terrible. But then parts of it were better. So it was, I don't know, it was interesting.
Well, that is
Cut both
interesting.
ways, yeah.
I find when I write a new book and it comes out, then that
Yeah.
sort of solves. I look back more lovingly on the ones that came before. I don't know. I
Yeah,
wonder
it
if
is.
it will. I
It's
bet
a-
your relationship with it will change over time.
I
too.
think so.
Yeah.
And the weird thing about a book is that it's such a kind of a time capsule of your preoccupations and your kind of affections and your loves of a very certain part of your life. And you can kind of come in and out of love with that kind of time capsule. It's quite interesting.
That is.
In a way, it's that you grow up and the book doesn't.
Yeah.
But it's also that the book, it kind of changes. Your relationship with it is constantly changing. I think it's quite peculiar.
Oh, that's neat.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm just going to do a quick time check. Okay. So then, after then, you moved on to do some screenwriting. The Luminaries and the rehearsal. You.
Oh, not the rehearsal.
You didn't write that script.
No, that was
I
that.
thought you
Yeah,
did.
that was somebody else. That was. That's interesting you said that. Actually, that was. So my first novel was adapted for the screen, and it was partly letting that project go and just saying, okay, do with it what you will. I kind of gave the filmmakers my blessing and just said, I'm just interested to know what you do with this. I kind of got curious about it. I think it was partly after that I was like, I'm kind of I want to know
That you
more.
got interested in writing for.
Yeah.
Alison McLean said of working with you, and she was the showrunner for the rehearsal or the director?
The director, and
The
it's
director.
actually also a Canadian-born
Oh, really?
person who grew up in New Zealand.
Ah, neat.
Yeah, so we
Oh,
have the
so you
same
have a
biography,
connection.
Yeah.
So she said of working with you, she was just very curious about what a film can do that's different from what a book does. So what did you, when you were working on the Luminaries, for example, what did you feel that you can do on screen that you can't do on the page?
Well, I think that there's a certain kind of elasticity that is possible on the page when it comes to both space and time. Within a paragraph, you can make both space and time flex according to the mind of the paragraph. So if you're in somebody's mind who's remembering something, or they're thinking ahead to something, or they're trying not to think about something, or they're kind of ruminating on something, those are kind of possible shapes that the paragraph can take. Whereas on screen, you're always bounded in terms of space and time.
Right.
You're bounded spatially because you can only fit what you can fit in the frame. You can't see anything more than that. Although, of course, it can be close or far away or whatever. And then you're bounded temporally because an hour of television has to be an hour. You can't watch TV fast. I mean, I guess you could watch it on fast forward, but
Yeah.
for the purposes of what I'm saying, let's all agree.
Yeah.
And so I think that those two things are quite. They each have their advantages and disadvantages. You know, there's this way that film is always external. You're always looking at a character and thinking, or at an actor playing a character and thinking, wow, you know, like I'm getting drawn into them. I'm kind of so invested in their story that I'm moved by them. I'm moved by the performance. I'm moved by their predicament. But you remain you, and they remain them. They are on screen, and you're looking at them. Whereas on a book, you're looking through somebody. You can kind of embody a character in a book. You can start to think as they think, and to breathe as they breathe, and to kind of feel as they feel. And what the book notices is what you notice as the reader. So there's kind of this very, very close identification with character that you can get in a novel that I think you can only ever. It's just a little different on screen.
Yeah.
I think that seduction on screen is so wonderful because actors are so good looking, and it's so
Right.
just so fun to look at them, and they can often do so much with so little. One of the things that's so fascinating to learn as a screenwriter is that you know, very self-importantly, you write out these big long scenes, very kind of novelistic scenes where a character will say this and another character will respond that, and it kind of goes down and down the page. Then you get into the shoot, the camera starts rolling, and these beautiful actors just kind of turn to one another with these kind of these lampshade kind of eyes, and you think, oh shit, I don't need any of the, like they did it. I don't know, all of that dialogue, it doesn't matter, you know, because they told that. They emoted that with a glance or whatever it is. So it's kind of a funny journey. It was a funny journey for me because I went in like many people. Many people go into screenwriting thinking that the skill of the screenwriter is a skill of dialogue, when actually I think what most screenwriters end up kind of believing is that dialogue is not. It's kind of quite far down the list of important skills that you need as a screenwriter. It's it's weirdly kind of incidental.
Right.
Really, the art of screenwriting is the art of dramatic structure. It's the art of kind of guiding an emotional, a kind of an emotional logic by the kind of the placement of scenes and even kind of angles and looks and shots. I mean, you're writing much more than the dialogue as the screenwriter. Though then, of course, it then gets rewritten.
Right.
by the director and by the actors and by the kind of the pressures of the shoot. Yes, it's an interesting complement to writing fiction because as a fiction writer, I think you can be so tyrannical. You're a total. You are totally omnipotent as a fiction writer. You can make time pass as quickly or as slowly as you like. You can make anybody exist or not exist. You can control the weather. I mean, you can literally do anything you want. Whereas as a screenwriter, you have to be responsive to real world problems.
Right. Yeah.
And you know, there are kind of limits on you as a screenwriter.
I've heard about the real world. It's hard, isn't
Yeah.
it? It's hard out there.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there was
avoid
all
it.
sorts of things that came up on the luminaries that were just, oh my God, we would just have to kind of write our way around them in a way that was often very humbling and even kind of devastating as a writer, because as a novelist, you're used to this kind of level of control that would say that, you know, absolutely everything here in this book is here because I wanted it to be kind of for better and for worse. So if there's anything here that doesn't work, it's because, you know, that's on me, you know. But as a screenwriter, you're often having to make choices that are not based on what you think would be the best for the story. They're choices that are just based on something totally different. So just to give one example, we had left till quite late in the luminaries one of the most pivotal scenes, which is the meeting of two of the major characters. And I'd written this quite elaborate scene. There was probably 20 or 30 people in the scene, and it was all taking place on this the deck of a ship. And there'd been some disagreement about whether we should build the deck of the ship on a lorry that would then stand in a field and the water would be added digitally, or whether it should be built on the deck of a barge and then the barge sailed somewhere in New Zealand. And we ended up choosing the barge option. Totally fine. Got to about 4 or 5 days before the shoot, and Maritime New Zealand, who's the kind of the shipping authority, came and said they weren't happy with the build, and they were only going to allow 4 people onto this craft legally. And so we said, oh, well, this is a bit difficult because there are 2 people in the scene, so that takes out 2 of them. We're going to need a cameraman, so maybe the last person, could they be, like, is that the director, or could we have, like, another actor? And they said, oh, no, that 4 includes the skipper of the boat, so the guy who's right off stage, you know, steering, and hopefully he's going to be on hand if anything goes wrong. And so it's those kinds of problems where as a writer, you're just thinking, oh my God, like everything that I wrote, I can't use. And now I have to really lamely kind of patch together something that's kind of, that if it was just up to me, this would not be the way that I would write it.
Yeah.
And so you have to kind of learn a kind of a humility as a screenwriter.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, which can be quite painful.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sounds it. Well, I think we should turn to Birnam Wood now. This is Eleanor's new book, as I was saying. It was described, I was telling Eleanor this at lunch, that it was described as a thriller in the marketing information I got. And I was thinking, oh yes, they like to put that tag on more literary books to see if they can get it in more people's hands and that sort of thing. And then I started and I thought, oh, I'm right about that. And then by the time I finished, I had white knuckles. It's an absolute thrill. It really is. So I'm excited. I hope lots of you get a copy and read it, because I want to talk to people about it. There's a problem with reading it in advance. But it is about a gardening collective called Birnam Wood. And they're on the brink of collapse, and when the founder, Mira, enters into an agreement with a billionaire survivalist who's come to New Zealand. And it's the story of sort of what happens thereafter. And Eleanor, I wanted to invite you to do a bit of a reading from the book.
Sure,
Great.
yeah. I'm going to read from quite late in the book, actually almost towards the end, which is, yeah, I don't know, maybe a bit unorthodox, but just to set up this passage, in, I think it was 2011, the New Zealand government at the time floated the idea of dramatically expanding mining operations into the country's national parks. And at that time undertook what they called a stocktake of the country's mineral resources, specifically those resources that lay on conservation, or so-called conservation land. And the whole idea that you could ever price up the value of it was just this kind of absurd kind of profit-seeking behavior. And luckily, the outrage against this was kind of so great, not just from within New Zealand, but from around the world, that this proposal never became law. But in this book, I kind of take that stocktake that was undertaken in New Zealand and kind of play with it thematically. So that kind of sets up what I'm about to read. So this follows one of the younger characters in the novel. The novel's kind of arranged generationally, with a baby boomer couple, a Gen X billionaire, and then these millennial activists. And this is one of the activists. He's an aspiring an investigative journalist at this point. He sat shivering, still soaking wet, still breathing hard, his pulse still throbbing in his neck. The government's proposal had not been scrapped at all. They hadn't caved in the face of public pressure. They hadn't respected peaceful protest. They hadn't capitulated to the public mood. They had simply begun mining the country's national parks in secret, against the will of the people, without the knowledge of the people, illegally, immorally, without environmental oversight or oversight of any kind, and given the Autonomo connection, in collusion with a foreign company to boot. It was a theft of historic proportions. It was conspiracy and corruption at the highest level. It was an offense against democracy. It was the gravest conspiracy, the most shocking lie, the most egregious rape of nature and abuse of power in the entire history of his country. It was treason. Treason, Tony repeated dumbly in his mind, thinking how antique and even fanciful it seemed. He was so staggered that he started to laugh, but his laughter subsided almost at once, and in its place he felt a wave of fury and despair roll over him at the sheer inexorability of late capitalist degradation, not just of the environment, not just of civic institutions, not just of intellectual and political ideals, but worse, of his own expectations, of what he even felt was possible anymore, a familiar surge of grief and helpless rage at the reckless, wasteful, soulless, narcissistic pathetic, barren selfishness of the present day, and at his own political irrelevance and impotence, and at the utter shamelessness with which his natural inheritance, his future, had been either sold or laid to waste by his parents' generation, trapping him in a perpetual adolescence that was further heightened by the infantilizing unreality of the internet as it encroached upon and colonized real life, Tony thought with bitter air quotes. For late capitalism would admit nothing real beyond the logic of late capitalism itself, having declared self-interest the only universal, and profit motive the only absolute, and deriding everything that did not serve its ends as either a contemptible weakness or a fantasy. Then that subsided too, and he was left trembling, heart pounding, chest brimming with a feeling that was very like euphoria. Aloud he said, Jesus Christ, and then again, Jesus Christ, and then, hushed in wonderment, he said, I am going to be so fucking famous.
That's great. So I think you can feel from that passage it's a political novel, and a novel of really big ideas. Set in this undercurrent of suspense that starts slowly. There's a build, and you really get to know all the characters in intricate detail, and then their inner lives, which you know so well, by the second half starts to kick, and it's an incredible read for that, for how it comes together and how the characters play off each other. One of the characters I was interested in was Robert, who is the billionaire, and he's come to New Zealand to build a bunker. Mm-hmm. But he's, can you tell me a bit about how you developed him?
Sure, yeah. Well, I mean, I would expect that it's probably quite well known everywhere that New Zealand has been famously hospitable to the ultra-wealthy of the world. Many of whom make no secret of the fact that they are buying up tracts of land in order to have a place to flee in the event of a kind of a global catastrophe that's presumably going to kill the rest of us. But lucky for them, they're going to have a kind of a nice place to wait it out. And that has always really angered me. You know, New Zealand is, like many places in the world, has, you know, entrenched intergenerational injustice, you know, racial injustice when it comes to the country's relationship with land. There's a property crisis in the country, and so it still feels very unfair to me and kind of worthy of kind of satire and you know, fury that this is happening in this way. That I kind of wanted to expose New Zealand's kind of deep complicity with, you know, economic injustice around the world by being so hospitable to these, you know, who are often very, very bad actors. The most famous example, of course, is Peter Thiel, the guy behind PayPal and all the rest, who was granted New Zealand citizenship after spending, I think, kind of 8 days in the country in his life, purely on the basis that he was a wealthy man, and so therefore kind of, you know, New Zealanders kind of fell over themselves, kind of wanting to attract his investment. You know, which, by the way, was probably, you know, an investment that helped him much more than it helped New Zealand in terms of a kind of a net value. I've become very tedious when I talk about taxation. It's one of my favourite things to talk about. But a lot of people don't know that New Zealand is in a lot of ways a kind of a tax haven. It had one of the world's lowest top tax rates for a really long time. It's only just been raised to 39%, but it was 33% until Jacinda Ardern got into government, actually. And it's also kind of remarkable among developed nations in that it has no capital gains tax at all. And whenever any politician even suggests introducing one, there's just such an outcry in the country because everybody's so used to having, you know, their capital grow in these ways that then they can just kind of profit off endlessly. If they have wealth to begin with. Yeah. You know, if you don't have wealth to begin with, if you happen to have the disability of being young, you know, then, you know, that's, I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're screwed, basically. Anyway, I'm not really talking about Birnam Wood, I suppose. I get kind of cross when I talk about these
Well,
things.
actually, but it ties into my next question, which was, I thought one of the brilliant things you did in the book was build the characters around their reaction to the billionaire. So the head of the collective, for example, Mira,
Yeah,
who's a
right.
fascinating character, you revealed quite a bit about her and how she felt about the billionaire and started to work with him as well.
Yeah, I was interested in, how much we venerate the very, very wealthy. We're so drawn to them. We're so fascinated by them. There's this kind of, we kind of go mad for them. I don't know. I kind of wanted him to have this charisma and this allure in the book, that he would be very much a kind of a tempting figure. It's very much the case in New Zealand that whenever a very wealthy person comes to the country, there's the sense of everybody feeling quite kind of pleased to have been noticed. I don't know. There's this it's this kind of funny feeling that we're willing to forgive quite a lot because we're just so pleased. The proximity pleases us so much.
The book was very funny, I think, in that.
Yeah,
and there was
right.
As a Canadian,
Yeah.
I could relate to some of the passages
Right, yeah.
about wanting to be
Right.
seen or wanting to be, recognized internationally.
Yeah, and I think, I wouldn't want to speak for the Canadian perspective, but I think that there would be probably a lot of similarities in New Zealand. I think that there's a sense in which New Zealanders are very used to a kind of routine self-exemption when it comes to talking about global injustice, just because we're very small, we're very remote, very peaceful. We kind of never did anybody any harm, and so there's this kind of sense of flattery that goes on constantly in New Zealand. I think where I think in many ways the country has quite an immature self-image, and it's a self-image that's based on never being the bad guy. When anybody ever talks about New Zealand, they're never really talking about the harm that New Zealand has perpetrated in the world. But we're all in this together. When we face environmental crisis, everybody is as it's incumbent on all of us. It doesn't matter where you live.
Sounds familiar, doesn't it?
to do something about it, and especially as our lives become more and more mediated through screens. We're surrounded by screens all the time, all of which have in them these precious metals that that kind of become the focus of this book, but most of which have been mined far from where we live. So we can kind of have this idea that these devices have no environmental cost, or that they're at least it's kind of out of sight, out of mind. So I wanted to satirize all of that. I wanted to, my kind of original ambition for the book was to write a book in which none of the characters, hopefully, would see themselves as though they were the villain of the piece. If you were to say to any one of them, who is the Macbeth of this novel, they would all definitely point to somebody else, but they wouldn't point to themselves. But because the book would be designed in such a way as to kind of bring them together, they would kind of play the roles, the kind of central roles of Macbeth, the play, to one another. So each would be the kind of Lady Macbeth to somebody else, and each would be a kind of a tempting force, a kind of a witch's kind of tempting force. And then each would ultimately be a kind of a Birnam Wood. Famously from Macbeth, this is the wood that it is prophesied that Macbeth will never be vanquished until the wood comes to the castle where he lives. And he takes that as a statement of certainty. He says, okay, well, that's great. Nobody's going to vanquish me then because forests don't move. But of course, he's just not thinking. He's not thinking creatively enough about that problem. So that was the kind of the idea behind the placement of the characters relative to one another. And Lemoyne definitely, the billionaire character, definitely emerges as the arch villain of the piece. He's a psychopath, so he was quite a lot of fun to write, actually.
You get a look in your eye.
Yeah. I mean, it's that kind of perverse pleasure, of writing a character who is so unapologetic. I mean, he's evil, but of course, I mean, it's all in a novel. It's all fictional, thank God. But yeah, it is quite fun to write a character who really doesn't care about what other people think, because I'm kind of constantly plagued by self-doubt. So it's quite a fun holiday to, I don't know, occupy the mind of a psychopath for a while. Maybe I shouldn't admit that. It probably says something very bad about me.